For decades, Crystal Gayle was seen as the embodiment of softness. A voice that never raised itself above a whisper. A presence that felt calm even under the brightest stage lights. To the world, she appeared to live a single, seamless life, a country pop icon with floor-length hair, gentle songs, and a career untouched by scandal. But that image, carefully held for more than 30 years, concealed a quieter truth. Crystal Gayle did not live one life. She lived two, and the divide between them was never visible to those applauding from the dark. On the surface, her story followed a familiar American arc. From poverty to prominence. From a coal-dust childhood in Kentucky to global recognition. Yet beneath that ascent existed another existence running parallel to the public one. While the audience heard serenity and emotional balance, Crystal carried unresolved grief, identity conflict, and a lifelong struggle to define herself outside of a name that was never fully hers. The double life was not built on deception, but on endurance. One life was performed. The other was survived. Born Brenda Gayle Webb, she entered the world as the youngest of 8 children in a family already worn thin by hardship. Her father, a coal miner, died when she was still a child, leaving behind silence where stability should have been. That silence never truly lifted. Music became both refuge and necessity, not as a dream, but as a means to breathe. Yet even before her own voice was recognized, another voice filled every room she entered. Loretta Lynn. Sister. Idol. Shadow. As Loretta rose to national fame, Crystal's identity was quietly absorbed into someone else's legend. Every introduction, every article, every comparison reinforced the same message: she existed in relation, not in her own right. The public life began early, but the private self learned restraint just as fast. She learned how to smile without correcting assumptions. How to sing without revealing too much. How to succeed without ever appearing to compete. When Crystal eventually broke through with a sound entirely her own, the world believed it was witnessing liberation. A new star stepping into light. But the second life did not vanish. It deepened. Fame amplified the pressure to remain gentle, uncontroversial, untouched. While others rebelled or collapsed, Crystal perfected the art of emotional containment. She became known for her calm marriage, her lack of scandal, her refusal to participate in the noise of celebrity culture. What the world interpreted as peace was often discipline. For over 3 decades, Crystal Gayle balanced these two realities. On stage, she was warmth, nostalgia, and emotional reassurance. Off stage, she was a woman who carried loss quietly, who measured every public word, and who chose privacy not because she had nothing to hide, but because exposure demanded a vulnerability she could not afford. The double life was not dramatic. It was invisible. And that invisibility was precisely what allowed it to last. Only now, with time softening the need for performance, does the full weight of that divide become visible. Not as a revelation of scandal, but as an understanding. Crystal Gayle did not hide a secret life. She protected it. And in doing so, she preserved a voice that could soothe millions, even while it carried the echo of things never spoken aloud. The second life Crystal Gayle lived did not begin with fame. It began with absence. Long before the charts, the awards, and the quiet reverence of sold-out halls, there was a childhood defined by what was missing. A father lost too early. A home shaped by survival rather than comfort. And a sense, formed before she had language for it, that stability was something fragile, easily taken away. This was the foundation of the woman the public would never fully see. When her father died, Crystal was still learning how the world worked. His death did not arrive with drama or explanation. It arrived as silence. A silence that settled into the house and never left. Her mother, suddenly alone, carried the weight of 8 children and a future stripped of guarantees. For Crystal, the youngest, there was no gradual transition from innocence to awareness. Responsibility arrived early. Childhood ended quietly, without ceremony. In later years, she would describe music not as a passion, but as something instinctive, almost biological, as if singing were a way to keep herself intact. As the family moved away from Kentucky, geography changed but identity did not. The dust of Appalachia remained in her voice, in her phrasing, in the sadness that listeners would later mistake for romance. And then there was Loretta. Already on the radio. Already becoming a name people spoke with admiration. To the outside world, this connection looked like a blessing. To Crystal, it was more complicated. Love and pride coexisted with a constant sense of displacement. She was never simply a young girl learning who she was. She was always Loretta Lynn's sister. That label followed her everywhere. At school. At church. At early performances. It shaped expectations before she opened her mouth. If she sounded similar, she was a copy. If she sounded different, she was compared anyway. There was no neutral ground. This is where the second life began to form. Publicly, she smiled and complied. Privately, she learned to shrink. To soften herself. To become less threatening, less ambitious, less visible in ways that might provoke resistance. When she stepped onto the stage of the Grand Ole Opry for the first time, filling in for Loretta, the moment looked like opportunity. But internally, it was terror. Not fear of performing, but fear of being measured. Fear that her worth would be calculated solely in comparison. That night, when the audience fell silent, Crystal realized something critical. Music could give her independence, but only if she found a way to sound like no one else. That realization did not bring relief. It brought pressure. Her early recording years were marked by uncertainty. Signed to the same label as Loretta, encouraged to follow the same musical path, she felt trapped between gratitude and suffocation. Even her name was taken from her. Brenda was deemed unsuitable. Crystal Gayle was chosen for her, polished and marketable. A reinvention that felt both necessary and alien. The industry believed it was giving her an identity. In truth, it was asking her to replace one shadow with another. Criticism came quickly. Reviewers described her songs as weaker echoes. Audiences listened through the lens of comparison. With each release, the divide between her two lives widened. The public Crystal was present, professional, endlessly patient. The private Crystal questioned whether her voice had value at all. This internal erosion never reached headlines. It manifested in restraint. In a refusal to push back. In a growing determination to survive rather than confront. Leaving her first label was not just a career move. It was an act of self-preservation. Under a new producer who recognized the strength in her softness, Crystal was finally allowed to stop competing with a ghost. She was encouraged to sing quietly. To lean into vulnerability rather than power. This shift did not eliminate her second life. It refined it. She learned how to channel pain into control. How to turn emotional restraint into a signature. By the time success arrived, the double life was fully established. The world saw serenity. What it did not see was the cost. Every gentle note carried years of self-suppression. Every calm interview masked a woman trained to disappear emotionally. Crystal Gayle did not become soft because life was kind to her. She became soft because softness was how she survived. By the late 1970s, Crystal Gayle had achieved what once seemed impossible. She was no longer introduced as someone's sister. Her name stood alone on marquees. Her voice dominated radio waves across continents. Yet this period, often remembered as the height of her freedom, was also when her double life reached its most delicate balance. Success did not replace the private self she had built in silence. It required her to protect it more carefully than ever. The breakthrough of "Don't It Make My Brown Eyes Blue" changed everything on the surface. The song crossed borders that country music had rarely crossed before. It carried Crystal into mainstream pop without stripping her of authenticity. The industry praised her restraint, her elegance, her refusal to oversing. Critics spoke of purity. Audiences felt comforted. But behind that clarity was a woman acutely aware that one wrong move could collapse the fragile space she had carved out for herself. Fame brought visibility, and visibility brought vulnerability. Crystal understood early that the industry did not reward women who revealed too much. While her male peers were allowed chaos and excess, she was expected to remain a symbol. Graceful. Accessible. Unthreatening. Any deviation from that image risked being interpreted as instability or ingratitude. So she chose consistency. Not because it was easy, but because it was safe. Her marriage to Bill Gatzimos became central to maintaining that balance. Publicly, it was a model of stability. Privately, it was an anchor. Bill was not part of the music world. He did not chase attention. His presence allowed Crystal to step off stage without explanation. By making him her manager, she created a buffer between herself and an industry that had once controlled her identity. It was a quiet assertion of autonomy, disguised as tradition. As tours expanded and demands increased, Crystal refined the separation between her two lives. On stage, she performed emotional intimacy without personal exposure. Her songs spoke of longing, regret, and vulnerability, yet rarely aligned with specific events from her own life. This distance was intentional. It allowed listeners to project their own experiences onto her music, while her own remained protected. The performance became a form of emotional translation rather than confession. Motherhood deepened this divide. When her children were born, Crystal refused to outsource her presence. She adjusted tours, delayed projects, and structured her schedule around their needs. To the public, this appeared as effortless balance. In reality, it required relentless control. She moved between roles without overlap. Artist. Mother. Wife. Each life intact, none allowed to bleed too far into the others. The discipline she had learned as a child became essential. Throughout the 1980s, her career continued to thrive. Hits followed hits. Awards accumulated. But something subtle shifted. Crystal became increasingly selective. She declined opportunities that required excessive exposure. She avoided media narratives that demanded personal revelation. Unlike many of her peers, she did not chase reinvention. The industry interpreted this as contentment. In truth, it was preservation. This was the paradox of her double life. The more successful she became, the more necessary the separation grew. Fame had given her independence, but it had not erased the instincts formed in poverty and loss. She still guarded against instability. Still measured risk. Still believed that safety came from restraint rather than assertion. As trends changed and the spotlight moved toward louder, more provocative figures, Crystal stepped back without protest. She did not frame it as retreat. She framed it as choice. The public life gradually softened. Performances became rarer. Albums more reflective. The private life expanded quietly into its place. By the time she entered her later years, the divide between the two lives no longer felt like conflict. It felt like resolution. Crystal Gayle had learned how to exist without being consumed by either identity. She remained an icon without clinging to visibility. She remained private without withdrawing from meaning. The double life that once demanded constant vigilance became a structure that held her steady. What the world saw as gentleness was never weakness. It was a strategy. A way of navigating a system that rarely allowed women to be whole. Crystal Gayle did not survive her career by demanding space. She survived it by shaping boundaries so quietly that no one realized they were there at all. The illusion that Crystal Gayle's life was untouched by rupture persisted for decades, largely because she never allowed the public to witness moments of collapse. Where others unraveled in front of cameras, Crystal retreated. Where the industry demanded reinvention, she responded with silence. This was not avoidance. It was a deeply learned response to loss, one that would be tested most severely as time began to take away the few people who truly knew her second life. The passing of Loretta Lynn marked a turning point that no chart position or award ever could. For the world, Loretta's death was the loss of a legend. For Crystal, it was the disappearance of the one person who understood the entire arc of her existence. Sister. Mentor. Mirror. Rival. Protector. No matter how far Crystal had traveled from Loretta's shadow professionally, emotionally that bond had never loosened. Loretta was the only witness to Crystal before the industry, before the careful division between public and private selves. In the months following Loretta's death, Crystal withdrew almost completely. There were no dramatic statements. No visible mourning rituals. This absence confused fans who had grown accustomed to her steadiness. But grief, for Crystal, had never been something to perform. It was something to endure quietly. Just as she had done as a child when her father died, she responded to loss by narrowing her world until it felt manageable again. This withdrawal revealed something essential about the double life she had lived. For years, music had functioned as a controlled outlet for emotion. A place where pain could exist without overwhelming her. But grief on this scale resisted containment. It seeped into the spaces she had carefully protected. Songs that once felt like refuge now carried too much weight. Silence became safer. As performances grew rarer, the narrative surrounding Crystal shifted. Some assumed decline. Others assumed retirement. In truth, neither fully applied. She was not stepping away from music because she could no longer sing. She was recalibrating the terms under which she would allow herself to be seen. For the first time, the second life took precedence without apology. In private, her days became slower. Domestic. Grounded in routines that had nothing to do with identity or legacy. Cooking. Walking. Reading. Spending time with grandchildren. These acts were not distractions from her career. They were affirmations of the life she had protected all along. A life that existed beyond applause. Her marriage to Bill deepened in this quieter phase. Without tours and schedules to structure time, they lived as two people who had survived decades together without spectacle. Conversations replaced logistics. Presence replaced planning. This stability was not accidental. It was the result of choices made repeatedly over a lifetime. Choices to value endurance over intensity. Continuity over drama. When Crystal did return to the stage, it was on her own terms. Smaller venues. Select audiences. Minimal promotion. Her voice, though altered by age, carried something it never had before. Not strength and volume, but weight and intention. Each performance felt less like entertainment and more like communion. She no longer sang to reassure the world. She sang to remain connected to it. The audience sensed this shift. Applause softened. Silence lingered longer. Listeners did not expect perfection. They listened for truth. And in those moments, the double life converged. The private grief informed the public sound. The boundaries she had once maintained blurred just enough to allow authenticity without exposure. This convergence did not mean revelation. Crystal never explained her pain. She did not frame her later years as a narrative of loss. She simply allowed the music to age with her. To become less polished. More human. The industry that once demanded consistency now watched with respect as she quietly redefined longevity. In the end, Crystal Gayle's double life was never about concealment. It was about control. The ability to choose what parts of oneself belong to the world and what parts remain untouched. As fame faded and time narrowed her circle, that control became freedom. Not freedom from music, but freedom within it. Part 4 is not the story of an ending. It is the story of integration. A woman who spent decades surviving division finally allowing her lives to coexist. Gently. Without explanation. Exactly as she had always lived. In the final stage of Crystal Gayle's story, the idea of a double life begins to dissolve. Not because the division was false, but because time gradually removes the need to maintain it. What remains is not a revelation, but a reckoning. A recognition that the quiet choices she made, year after year, were not acts of retreat, but acts of authorship over her own life. As the music industry accelerated toward spectacle, reinvention, and constant visibility, Crystal chose another path. She did not chase relevance. She allowed it to find her only when it mattered. This decision puzzled observers who were trained to interpret absence as decline. Yet Crystal's absence was deliberate. She had already learned, long ago, that survival did not depend on being seen constantly. It depended on knowing when to step away. Her later recordings reflect this clarity. They are unhurried, reflective, unconcerned with trends. Rather than attempting to recapture past success, they sit comfortably beside it. When she entered the studio with her son Christos, the experience carried symbolic weight. The child who once waited backstage now stood beside her as a collaborator. The two lives intersected again, not through pressure, but through continuity. Music was no longer a proving ground. It was a shared language across generations. Crystal's relationship with her audience evolved in parallel. Those who attended her later performances did not come seeking nostalgia alone. They came with an understanding that the woman on stage was no longer performing an image. She was offering presence. Her voice, weathered by time, carried nuance rather than precision. Listeners leaned in, not for power, but for meaning. The room no longer demanded distance between icon and individual. That distance had finally softened. The public narrative also shifted. Where once journalists searched for conflict or transformation, they began to speak of legacy. Not legacy as a monument, but as influence. The space Crystal created for softness in a demanding industry became visible only in hindsight. Younger artists cited her not for technique, but for permission. Permission to be gentle. To be private. To succeed without self-erasure. In this sense, the most radical part of Crystal Gayle's life was not her crossover success or her iconic image. It was her refusal to commodify her inner world. For over 30 years, she resisted the industry's hunger for confession. She did not sell pain. She translated it. She offered emotion without autobiography, allowing listeners to feel deeply without requiring her to relive her own wounds publicly. This restraint shaped her longevity. While others burned brightly and vanished, Crystal endured. Not by expanding outward, but by preserving inward space. The second life she guarded was not a secret waiting to be exposed. It was a sanctuary. And sanctuaries, by nature, lose their power when opened indiscriminately. In her present life, simplicity has replaced structure. The routines she once protected now define her days. Family meals. Quiet mornings. Familiar landscapes. These are not symbols of retreat, but of arrival. She has reached the life she was protecting all along. The one that existed before applause, and that would remain after it faded. Looking back, the idea that no one knew her double life becomes less about ignorance and more about misinterpretation. The signs were always there. In the softness of her voice. In the consistency of her choices. In her refusal to turn pain into spectacle. The world simply lacked the language to recognize restraint as strength. Crystal Gayle's legacy does not rest in mystery uncovered or truths revealed. It rests in an example rarely celebrated. That it is possible to live fully without living loudly. That an artist can shape culture without surrendering privacy. That endurance, when chosen consciously, can be a form of quiet rebellion. In the end, Crystal Gayle did not reconcile her two lives by exposing one to validate the other. She allowed them to merge naturally, as life itself narrowed toward what mattered most. There is no dramatic conclusion. No final confession. Only a woman who learned, over decades, that gentleness could be armor, and silence could be sovereignty. That is what remained after 30 years. Not a secret finally revealed, but a life finally understood. What ultimately sets Crystal Gayle apart is not the span of her career, nor the elegance of her voice, but the philosophy that quietly governed her life. Long after the applause softened and the urgency of fame faded, what remained was a woman who had mastered something far rarer than stardom. She had learned how to live without surrendering herself to the roles the world assigned her. In an industry built on exposure, Crystal practiced restraint as a form of self-respect. She never announced this philosophy. She never framed it as resistance. Yet every choice she made reinforced it. She spoke when necessary. She withdrew when needed. She allowed her work to speak with emotional clarity while keeping the origins of that emotion protected. This balance was not accidental. It was the result of decades spent observing how quickly artists were consumed by the very attention they sought. Her influence, therefore, extends beyond sound. It exists in behavior. An example. Younger artists who studied her path did not see a woman chasing validation. They saw someone setting terms. She demonstrated that longevity did not require constant reinvention, nor did relevance require self-exposure. What it required was coherence. A life in which values remained stable even as circumstances shifted. Crystal's gentleness, often misunderstood as passivity, was in fact deliberate strength. She did not push against the industry's pressures head-on. She stepped around them. Where others confronted, she redirected. Where others explained, she simplified. This approach deprived conflict of oxygen. It also protected her inner life from becoming public property. Over time, this quiet resistance became her signature. As she aged, the rewards of this philosophy became visible. She did not face the reckoning that often accompanies celebrity decline. There was no collapse, no dramatic reinvention, no desperate return. Instead, there was continuity. Her later appearances carried dignity rather than urgency. She was not asking to be remembered. She was simply present. In conversations, Crystal increasingly emphasized gratitude rather than achievement. Not because she dismissed her success, but because she had already metabolized it. Awards and honors no longer defined her. Relationships did. Memory did. Faith did. These were the constants that had existed before fame and remained afterward. The second life she once protected was no longer hidden. It was simply dominant. This shift reframed her legacy. Critics and historians began to recognize her not only as a musical bridge between country and pop, but as a cultural counterexample. In a landscape where female artists were often expected to perform vulnerability publicly to justify success, Crystal proved that emotional depth did not require disclosure. That pain could inform art without being consumed by it. Her voice, especially in later years, reflected this evolution. It carried less polish but more resonance. Listeners heard time in it. Experience. Acceptance. The softness that once felt like restraint now felt like wisdom. She no longer needed to control how she was perceived. Perception had lost its urgency. Perhaps the most telling aspect of Crystal Gayle's story is that there is no single moment where her double life collapses into revelation. There is no interview where everything is explained. No memoir that reframes the past. This absence is intentional. It honors the same principle that guided her career. Some lives are not meant to be summarized. They are meant to be respected. In the end, Crystal Gayle's quiet endurance stands as its own form of authorship. She did not let the industry write her narrative. She wrote it slowly, privately, and without spectacle. The two lives she lived were never in opposition. One sustained the other. One allowed survival. The other allowed meaning. What emerges, finally, is not the story of a woman who hid herself, but of a woman who understood the cost of being fully visible. She chose instead to remain intact. And in doing so, she left behind something more lasting than revelation. She left behind a model of grace that does not fade when the lights dim, because it was never dependent on them in the first place. In the final view of Crystal Gayle's life, there is no dramatic unveiling, no secret finally spoken aloud. The idea of a double life, once so compelling as a headline, resolves into something quieter and far more enduring. What Crystal Gayle lived was not a life of contradiction, but a life of careful separation, shaped by the understanding that not everything meaningful needs to be shared to be real. Her story challenges a modern assumption about fame, the belief that authenticity requires exposure. Crystal proved the opposite. She built a career of emotional honesty without autobiography, intimacy without intrusion. Listeners felt close to her not because they knew her story in detail, but because her voice created space for their own. In that sense, her privacy was not a barrier. It was an invitation. As time moved forward, the public gradually learned to read her silence differently. It was no longer interpreted as distance or withdrawal. It became a signal of completion. Crystal had nothing left to prove. She had already given what mattered most. Not an endless catalogue of confessions, but a body of work shaped by restraint, patience, and respect for the inner life. Her influence continues not through spectacle, but through permission. Permission for artists to age without apology. Permission to choose family over momentum. Permission to remain gentle in environments that reward noise. These are not lessons easily taught. They are absorbed slowly, through example rather than declaration. Crystal Gayle's life offers that example in its entirety. Looking back, the phrase "no one knew" feels misleading. The truth was always present, embedded in the consistency of her choices. The world simply mistook quiet for absence. In reality, Crystal was always fully there, fully engaged, simply unwilling to trade wholeness for visibility. Her double life was not a secret hidden from view. It was a boundary maintained with discipline. In her later years, as performances became rare and public appearances selective, the life she had protected finally stood unobstructed. Surrounded by family, memory, and routines untouched by fame, she lived the outcome of decades of intentional restraint. This was not retreat. It was arrival. Crystal Gayle's legacy does not depend on mystery solved or revelations made. It rests in the enduring impact of a woman who understood that gentleness can be strength, that silence can be sovereignty, and that a life well lived does not demand constant explanation. When her voice continues to echo through radios and memories, it carries more than melody. It carries a philosophy. And that philosophy is simple. To remain true, one does not need to be loud. One needs to be whole.